Hello and welcome. If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into history, philosophy, and psychology, you're in the right place. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss a new episode. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is over there. I love seeing our global community of night owls and dreamers coming together. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. In the early 20th century, America stood on the cusp of monumental change. The roaring 1920s are remembered as a time of jazz, flappers, and economic boom. But beneath the glittering facade of speakeasies and booming cities, a darker current flowed, one of social unrest, political hypocrisy, and a nationwide thirst for vice that law and order could not contain. The seeds of Al Capone's empire were sown long before he was ever called Scarface. They took root in the soil of a divided America. On one side stood the temperance movement, moralists and progressives who believed that alcohol was the source of society's worst ills. On the other side were everyday Americans, working-class immigrants, and urban dwellers who saw the new laws as an infringement on personal freedom. In 1920, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, launching the nation into what would become known as Prohibition. The Volstead Act enforced the law, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal across the country. But instead of ushering in a moral revolution, it created a black market economy unlike anything the country had ever seen. Almost overnight, a new kind of entrepreneur emerged. These were not polished businessmen or Wall Street tycoons. They were bootleggers, rum runners, and gangsters. They turned basements into breweries and back alleys into smuggling routes. And they built empires, not through board meetings, but through violence, bribery, and fear. Chicago, in particular, became a hotspot of underworld activity. It was a city torn between progress and corruption, a place where politicians were bought as easily as bottles of whiskey. It was here, amid the smoke and blood of a city at war with itself, that a young man from Brooklyn named Alphonse Gabriel Capone found his calling. Capone wasn't born into crime. He was born into poverty. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up in the tough neighborhoods of New York, where survival meant toughness and loyalty. He dropped out of school after hitting a teacher and fell in with local gangs. Among them was the 5 Points Gang, run by Johnny Torrio, a man who would later become Capone's mentor and ticket to Chicago. Torrio recognized something in the young Capone, not just his size and willingness to fight, but his mind. Capone wasn't just muscle, he was intelligent, calculating, and charismatic. He could win people over just as easily as he could terrify them. It was this combination that would one day make him king of Chicago's underworld. In 1919, Torrio invited Capone to join him in Chicago. It was a city primed for a takeover. As Prohibition went into full effect, Torrio's operation needed strong, smart men to run the increasingly lucrative bootlegging business. Capone accepted, eager to escape New York and its rival gangs. He brought with him not just ambition, but a sense of destiny. Capone started small, running errands, managing bars, enforcing loyalty, but it didn't take long for him to rise. Torrio trusted him implicitly and gave him more power and responsibility. And Capone didn't just enforce Torrio's empire, he expanded it. Through deals, threats, and strategic alliances, he began building a reputation that would soon eclipse his mentors. But as Capone rose, so did the violence. Chicago became a battleground. Rival gangs fought for control of territories and supply routes. The city's politicians and police were caught in the crossfire or on the payroll. And as bodies piled up, the name Al Capone began to strike fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone would no longer be just a soldier or a lieutenant. He would become the face of organized crime in America. But to understand his empire, we first need to understand the world that allowed it to exist. A world drunk on power, desperate for escape, and more than willing to look the other way, so long as the drinks kept flowing. When Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived in Chicago in 1910, he was only 20 years old. To most, he was just another streetwise kid from Brooklyn. But beneath the rough exterior and thick New York accent was a young man who had absorbed the lessons of the underworld like scripture. He had learned early on that in America, especially for immigrants, the rules of power were different. Respect wasn't given, it was taken. Chicago was fertile ground. With Prohibition in full swing, alcohol had become more than a vice. It was a currency. And whoever controlled that currency controlled the city. Capone's introduction to the criminal world of Chicago came under the wing of his mentor, Johnny Torrio. Torrio was unlike the loud, brash gangsters often imagined in fiction. He was methodical, business-minded, and calm. He saw organized crime not as chaos, but as an industry. To him, bootlegging wasn't just about smuggling liquor. It was about logistics, market control, and public relations. Torrio was grooming Capone not just as a trusted enforcer, but as his eventual successor. Capone started out working as a bartender and bouncer at the Four Juices, one of Torrio's most profitable brothels in Chicago's Levee District. He was effective, loyal, and unafraid of confrontation. He also began showing his business savvy, finding new revenue streams, managing supply chains, and making crucial connections. But Capone wasn't just dealing with bottles of booze and the brothel's books. He was navigating a labyrinth of violence, bribery, and betrayal. Chicago's underworld was fiercely territorial. Rival gangs, especially the North Side gang led by Dean O'Banion, controlled significant parts of the city and weren't keen on sharing. Every shipment of liquor was a potential flashpoint. Every handshake might be followed by a gunshot. Capone, however, had a way of making allies out of enemies, or at least silencing them. He was charming when needed, ruthless when not. He understood people, their weaknesses, their fears. And he used that understanding not only to stay alive, but to thrive. he also understood the importance of image. Unlike many gangsters who hid in the shadows, Capone embraced the spotlight. He dressed in custom-made suits, wore fedoras tipped just so, and drove luxurious cars. He made public appearances at baseball games, nightclubs, and restaurants. And most notably, he gave back to the poor. Capone understood something crucial about power. It wasn't just about fear, it was about affection. In neighborhoods where the government had failed to provide, Capone filled the void. He opened soup kitchens, handed out clothes during the winter, and paid rent for struggling families. For many in Chicago's South Side, Capone wasn't a criminal. He was a hero. Behind the scenes, though, the empire was being forged in blood. In 1924, the fragile peace among Chicago's gangs shattered when Dean O'Banion was assassinated. While Capone wasn't directly tied to the murder, it was widely believed that Torrio had orchestrated it with Capone's knowledge. O'Banion's death sparked a brutal war between the South Side Italian gangs and the North Side Irish gang. That war almost ended Capone's rise before it began. In 1925, Johnny Torrio was ambushed outside his home by North Side gunmen. He survived, but was shaken. After recovering, he decided to retire and return to New York. He handed over the entire Chicago operation to Capone. At just 26 years old, Al Capone was now the head of Chicago's most powerful criminal organization. He controlled the majority of the city's bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. His annual income was estimated at over $100 million, a staggering amount at the time. But power in the criminal underworld is always temporary. The more Capone grew, the more attention he attracted, from the police, from federal agents, and from enemies, both old and new. Every new deal was a risk. Every night out could end in gunfire. Capone responded by doubling down. He surrounded himself with loyal men, enforcers like Frank Nitti, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, and Tony Joe Batters Accardo. These men didn't ask questions. They carried out orders, and those orders often ended with bodies in alleyways or at the bottom of the Chicago River. Capone also developed a keen sense for politics. He knew that bribery was often more effective than bullets. Police departments, city officials, even judges, many were on his payroll. He paid them not just to look the other way, but to ensure that competitors were targeted and investigations conveniently stalled. Despite the growing violence, Capone maintained a paradoxical public image. He claimed to be a businessman. He argued that he was simply giving the people what they wanted: alcohol, entertainment, excitement, and in many ways, he was right. Prohibition had criminalized something that millions of Americans still desired. Capone's empire flourished not just because he was cunning, but because the laws themselves created an unfillable void. But beneath the tailored suits and charitable smiles was a man under immense pressure. Rival gangs were constantly scheming. The press was hounding him, and federal agents, led by a rising young investigator named Elliot Ness, were beginning to close in. Capone's days of unchecked expansion were nearing their end, but for a brief moment, between the late 1920s and early 1930s, he was untouchable. He was the king of Chicago, the master of an empire built on vice, violence, and audacity. Yet empires built on blood rarely last. The cracks were beginning to form, and soon the very tools that had made Capone powerful, money, fear, and fame, would become the weapons of his undoing. By the time Al Capone had solidified his rule over Chicago's underworld, the city had transformed into a landscape of wealth and chaos. On the surface, it sparkled with the illusion of modernity: towering buildings, roaring jazz clubs, bustling speakeasies. But beneath it all ran rivers of tension. The city was divided by race, by class, by ethnicity, and increasingly by bullets. Capone's rise didn't occur in a vacuum. He was not the only one trying to carve out a kingdom in the black market born from Prohibition. Dozens of gangs operated across Chicago, each claiming turf and protecting it with absolute brutality. These weren't street brawls. They were calculated military operations with foot soldiers, war councils, and public casualties. The most powerful opposition to Capone's dominance came from the North Side Gang, once led by Dino Banyan, and, after his death, by a succession of hardened men: Jaime Weiss, Vincent Drucci, and George Bugs Moran. Unlike Capone's Italian outfit based in the South Side, the North Siders were largely Irish, and their rivalry was rooted not only in economics, but in blood. Capone tried diplomacy at first. He was not a man who enjoyed unnecessary conflict. He preferred control. Control brought money, and money brought more control. But the North Side Gang wouldn't yield. After O'Banion's assassination, they launched a series of deadly retaliations, including the near-fatal shooting of Johnny Torrio and multiple ambushes on Capone himself. One of the most brazen attempts occurred in 1926, when Capone was dining at the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero, his de facto headquarters. As he enjoyed lunch with associates, a convoy of vehicles drove by and opened fire with automatic weapons, spraying the restaurant with over 1,000 rounds. Capone barely escaped with his life. The message was clear: no one was safe, not even the king. In response, Capone authorized more direct action. The gang war escalated with alarming intensity. Chicago's newspapers began running daily stories of bombings, shootouts, and murders. Children found shell casings on their walk to school. Shopkeepers closed early. Citizens learned to hit the ground at the sound of screeching tires. Capone, paradoxically, began to call for peace. He offered truces, met with other gang leaders, and even claimed he wanted to stabilize the city. He told reporters that the violence was bad for business, bad for morale, and bad for reputation. But in reality, these overtures were tactical. He wanted to weaken his enemies' resolve, lull them into complacency, and strike when the moment was right. That moment came on Valentine's Day, 1929. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains one of the most infamous events in American criminal history. The target was George "Bugs" Moran, the last serious rival to Capone's supremacy in Chicago. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. On the morning of February 14th, 7 members of Moran's gang gathered in a garage on North Clark Street, awaiting a shipment of illegal whiskey. Suddenly, 2 men dressed as police officers, accompanied by 2 in plain clothes, entered the garage. Believing it was a routine raid, the gangsters complied, raising their hands and turning to face the wall. What followed was a merciless execution. All 7 men were gunned down with Thompson submachine guns, their bodies riddled with over 70 bullets. The scene was so shocking that even seasoned police officers were disturbed. Blood stained the concrete, and the walls were shredded by gunfire. One of the victims, Frank Gusenberg, was still alive when police arrived. Asked who had shot him, he simply replied, "No one shot me," and died minutes later. Though Capone was in Florida at the time, and no one was ever officially charged, the massacre was immediately tied to him. It had all the hallmarks of a Capone operation: deception, ruthlessness, and a message delivered in blood. The North Side gang was effectively broken. Moran survived, but his influence waned. Capone had won the war, but victory came at a cost. The public, once charmed by Capone's Robin Hood persona, began to turn. The massacre had crossed a line. It wasn't just gangsters killing gangsters anymore. It was a slaughter. Newspaper headlines screamed of terror. Politicians demanded action, and law enforcement, embarrassed by their failure to contain the violence, intensified their efforts. Capone's high profile, once his greatest weapon, became a liability. He couldn't hide in the shadows. He was the most famous man in Chicago, perhaps in all of America. And as the walls closed in, so too did the number of enemies willing to betray him for safety, status, or survival. Still, Capone remained unshaken on the surface. He hosted lavish parties, attended prize fights, and walked through the streets with bodyguards and smiles. But his empire had shifted. It was no longer built on growth. It was built on fear and inertia. The blood on Chicago's streets had stained not only his hands, but the very fabric of the city itself. The next phase of Capone's story wouldn't be written in gunpowder. It would be written in ledgers, law books, and courtrooms. The age of the gangster was beginning to give way to the age of the federal investigator. And at the center of it all, Al Capone remained, for now, the last man standing. By the early 1930s, Al Capone was at the height of his notoriety. His name was recognized across America, not just as a gangster, but as a symbol of defiance, excess, and the failure of prohibition. His empire was making tens of millions of dollars annually, powered by illegal liquor, gambling, extortion, and prostitution. He wielded immense influence over Chicago, with judges, aldermen, and police officers lining their pockets with his cash. But while Capone basked in fame, the pressure from federal authorities was beginning to mount. For years, city officials had turned a blind eye. Bribes kept raids to a minimum, and witnesses mysteriously forgot what they'd seen. The police, overwhelmed and corrupted, were powerless. But in Washington, a new strategy was emerging. The federal government, humiliated by the violence of the St. Valentine's Day massacre and the brazen power of organized crime, decided that Al Capone must be brought down, not just for justice, but as a symbol. The challenge, however, was enormous. Capone was careful. He didn't sign documents. He didn't appear at crime scenes. He didn't carry weapons. Everything flowed through intermediaries, and anyone who dared to testify quickly vanished or recanted. Enter Elliot Ness. Ness was a young agent with the newly formed Bureau of Prohibition, a division under the Department of the Treasury. Smart, disciplined, and incorruptible, Ness was given a special mission: form a task force to bring down Al Capone. He assembled a small team of hand-picked agents, men who could not be bought or intimidated. They became known as the Untouchables. Their focus was liquor. Capone's empire relied heavily on the production and distribution of illegal alcohol. By targeting breweries, distilleries, and smuggling routes, Ness aimed to cripple the flow of money and goods. His team launched a relentless campaign of raids, destroying stills and seizing trucks. They followed the money, traced shipments, and tightened the noose. Capone was furious. He offered Ness bribes, first politely, then persistently. When that failed, he turned to threats. Ness received anonymous calls, notes, and even bullets through his window. But he stood firm. Every time Capone's men rebuilt a facility, Ness tore it down. And though the raids weren't enough to bring Capone to trial, they kept him off balance and in the public eye. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a quieter battle was unfolding, one that would ultimately bring the empire crashing down. It wasn't waged with guns or raids. It was fought with paperwork, ledgers, and numbers. Federal investigators, particularly a team from the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, began examining Capone's finances. It was an unconventional angle. The government couldn't connect him to the murders or the racketeering directly, but he was spending enormous sums of money. Lavish cars, expensive suits, luxurious homes, and he wasn't filing tax returns. In those days, income tax laws were relatively new, but they were clear. If you earned money, legally or not, you had to pay taxes on it. And Capone, who had never bothered to hide his wealth, was an easy target. The investigation took years. Agents scoured records, questioned witnesses, and gathered every scrap of evidence they could find. Slowly, methodically, they built a case. It wasn't easy. Capone didn't keep traditional books, but they found enough proof through third-party accounts, intercepted ledgers, and testimony from former associates. The tide began to shift. In 1931, Al Capone was formally indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. He laughed at first, brushing off the charges. He had bought his way out of worse. But the federal government wasn't bluffing. This was their play, and they intended to win. Capone's lawyers attempted to negotiate. He offered to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge, however, rejected the deal. A trial date was set. Capone, accustomed to controlling the game, was now playing by someone else's rules. The trial became a media sensation. Crowds lined up outside the courthouse. Reporters swarmed the building. Capone, ever the showman, arrived in tailored suits, tipping his hat to the cameras. But inside, the mood was different. The evidence was damning. The IRS had built a meticulous case showing unreported income, unexplained expenses, and a lifestyle that far outstripped any declared earnings. Even Capone's legal team began to falter. They tried to sway the jury through intimidation and bribery, but the judge, James Wilkerson, caught wind of the scheme. He replaced the jury with a new, sequestered panel hours before the trial began, a move that shocked everyone, including Capone. Testimonies mounted. Accountants explained financial trails. Witnesses described luxury purchases. Slowly, Capone's bravado began to crack. The King of Chicago was sitting in a federal courtroom, unable to talk his way out. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came in. Guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and charged $30,000 in court costs. Capone, once untouchable, was now a federal prisoner. The law had done what bullets could not. It had dismantled the most powerful criminal empire in America, not with violence, but with math. But for Capone, prison would not just be a punishment, it would be a transformation. His empire was gone, his mind was slipping, and the world he had ruled with iron and charm was beginning to forget his name. Al Capone's conviction in 1931 marked a seismic shift in the story of organized crime in America. For the first time, the federal government had succeeded in taking down a criminal empire not by matching its violence, but by outmaneuvering it with intelligence, diligence, and patience. The courtroom may have handed down the sentence, but it was time itself that would carry out Capone's downfall. And it would do so slowly, relentlessly, and without mercy. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at the time. He was also ordered to pay massive fines and court costs, which, though significant, were minor compared to the billions he had controlled during his reign. But the real punishment wasn't the money, it was the confinement, the loss of power, the erosion of identity. The man who once controlled Chicago now wore a uniform like every other inmate. His first stop was Atlanta, U.S. Penitentiary, a maximum security federal prison. Capone arrived with the confidence of a man who had escaped 1,000 threats before. He believed, perhaps naively, that prison would be a temporary inconvenience, a small detour in his larger-than-life saga. He even tried to maintain a semblance of authority behind bars, bribing guards and enjoying minor comforts. But Atlanta wasn't the city streets. Power here didn't come from fear or favors. It came from discipline, silence, and isolation. And Capone, who thrived on interaction and manipulation, struggled. Worse still, his health began to fail. In truth, it had already begun years earlier. Unbeknownst to many, Capone had been battling neurosyphilis, a complication of untreated syphilis that affects the brain and nervous system. He had contracted the disease likely in his youth, but as was common at the time, it went undiagnosed and untreated. By the time he was imprisoned, the symptoms were accelerating. He experienced confusion, mood swings, paranoia, and memory loss. The once sharp mind that had built a criminal empire was beginning to dissolve. He became erratic and unpredictable. Other inmates noticed his behavior changing. He would stare blankly at walls, forget where he was, or speak to people who weren't there. His grip on reality weakened, and with it, his ability to maintain control or command respect. Then came Alcatraz. In 1934, Capone was transferred to the newly opened federal prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The Rock, as it would come to be known, was designed to hold the most dangerous, disruptive, or escape-prone prisoners in the country. Its purpose was to break the men who believed themselves untouchable. And Capone, in many ways, was the ultimate test. Alcatraz was different from any prison Capone had experienced. The guards could not be bribed. Contact with the outside world was severely limited. There were no favors, no luxuries, and no room for reputation. Everyone was stripped of identity, given a number, and expected to follow the rules or suffer the consequences. Capone was now inmate 85. The man who once hosted lavish parties with celebrities and politicians was assigned menial tasks like sewing and cleaning. He ate with hundreds of other inmates in silence, under the constant watch of armed guards. Attempts to intimidate or assert dominance were met with swift punishment. For the first time in his life, Capone was truly powerless, and the disease continued its silent, cruel work. By 1938, Capone's mental faculties had deteriorated so badly that he could barely follow conversations. He was often confused, frightened, and withdrawn. Fellow inmates mocked him. Some felt pity. He was no longer the fearsome boss of Chicago. He was a fading shadow of a man, plagued by hallucinations and paranoia, broken by confinement and illness. That same year, after serving nearly 8 years in prison, Capone was released on parole for good behavior, and because his health had declined so severely that he was deemed no longer a threat. He was barely 40 years old, but mentally he was already a different person. He returned to his estate on Palm Island, Florida, a mansion he had purchased during his reign, intended as a sunny retreat for a kingpin. Now it became his sanctuary and his prison. Capone spent his final years in a fog of dementia. He would sit in the garden and talk to birds. He believed he was still in power, giving imaginary orders to invisible men. His wife May and son Sonny protected him from the outside world, shielding him from reporters and curious onlookers. Visitors were rare, and few of his old associates came to see him. His empire had moved on. Others had filled the vacuum he left behind. The gangster age had evolved, but Capone had been left behind, both by the world and by his own mind. In 1947, Al Capone died of a stroke complicated by pneumonia and advanced neurosyphilis. He was 48 years old. His funeral was modest by comparison to his life. No parades, no lavish spectacles. Just a small ceremony attended by family and a few remaining loyalists. The man who once ruled a city with iron fists and gold rings was buried quietly in Mount Carmel Cemetery, under a plain stone. But his story didn't end there. Capone's name would live on in folklore, books, films, and documentaries. He would become a symbol, not just of crime and corruption, but of the American contradiction. He embodied the rags-to-riches dream, twisted by violence. He was both villain and anti-hero, both a product and a critique of the system that made him. And perhaps most notably, his fall served as a warning that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible, not even one built on fear, loyalty, and millions of dollars. Because in the end, Capone was not brought down by bullets or betrayal. He was undone by the very things he once thought he could ignore: law, disease, and time. His empire crumbled not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, painful descent into obscurity. And in that descent, the legend of Al Capone became complete, not because he lived forever, but because he didn't. When Al Capone was released from Alcatraz and faded into obscurity in Florida, the world didn't stop spinning. Chicago didn't suddenly become peaceful. The liquor didn't dry up. And the streets he once ruled didn't forget what had happened there. But they did change. The empire Capone had built was now without its emperor, and what followed was a critical moment in the history of American organized crime. The vacuum of power left in Capone's absence was immediate. Without his central authority, his organization, known as the Chicago Outfit, risked descending into chaos. Capone had always ruled with a mixture of charisma, calculation, and cruelty. His presence alone could hold factions together, but now the throne was empty, and every lieutenant had their eye on it. It was Frank Nitti, one of Capone's most trusted enforcers, who initially stepped into the role of de facto leader. Known as the Enforcer, Nitti was a sharp-dressed, quiet man who operated more behind the scenes than Capone ever had. Where Capone had enjoyed the spotlight, Nitti avoided it. He understood that attention was dangerous now. Capone's downfall had proven that. Nitti reorganized the outfit along stricter, more business-like lines. He focused not on bootlegging, which had already begun to fade with the looming repeal of prohibition, but on labor racketeering, gambling, and union control. The outfit's influence stretched into the Teamsters and other major labor organizations, allowing them to manipulate industries from the shadows. In many ways, this marked a new era in organized crime, one less flamboyant, less public, and far more insidious. The gangsters no longer needed to shoot up streets or bribe cops in broad daylight. They learned to wear suits, hold meetings in quiet offices, and infiltrate legitimate businesses. It was a transformation from criminal gangs into criminal corporations. But that didn't mean the violence stopped. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Chicago remained a battleground, just a quieter one. Killings were more calculated, less messy, and often carried out with professional efficiency. Witnesses disappeared. Investigators ran into dead ends. And through it all, the outfit continued to make money. Meanwhile, Prohibition ended. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th and effectively ending the nationwide ban on alcohol. It was, in many ways, a national admission of failure. Prohibition had not eliminated vice, it had fueled it. And though its end put a dent in organized crime's income, it didn't destroy the criminal networks that had been created to profit from it. On the contrary, those networks adapted. The speakeasies transformed into nightclubs. The smuggling routes found new cargo. The criminal organizations, no longer built for a single purpose, diversified. Capone's legacy, therefore, wasn't just about what he did. It was about what he showed was possible. He had proven that one man, through a mixture of fear, charisma, and timing, could rise to immense power without holding any public office. He had shown how weak the systems of law and governance could be when faced with corruption and public apathy. And most dangerously, he had made crime look glamorous. Hollywood took notice. By the late 1930s and 1940s, gangster films were becoming a cultural phenomenon. Characters inspired by Capone, some in name, others in spirit, filled the silver screen. They were dangerous, yes, but also bold, stylish, and in some ways, admirable. For a generation of Americans, Capone became less of a criminal and more of a tragic anti-hero, a man who played the game too well for too long and paid the price. But the reality behind the myth was far darker. Capone's reign had left scars across Chicago. Neighborhoods had been devastated by violence. Families had been torn apart. Trust in local government had eroded. The police force was demoralized, viewed more as pawns than protectors. And even as the city tried to clean up its image, the stain of the 1920s refused to fade. Historians would later debate Capone's impact. Some argued that he was a product of his environment, a symptom of societal failure, not its cause. Others saw him as a uniquely dangerous figure who exploited a broken system for personal gain. Either way, his shadow loomed large over the city he had once controlled. Even decades later, City leaders, journalists, and scholars would reference Capone when discussing corruption, crime, or the struggle for reform in Chicago. His name became shorthand for a particular type of power, one built outside the rules, but operating within society just enough to thrive. As for the Chicago outfit, it survived long after Capone, under Nitti and later leaders like Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana. The organization grew into one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in the United States. It extended its reach into Las Vegas casinos, Hollywood unions, and even national politics. But it did so more quietly than Capone ever had. The lessons of his downfall were never forgotten, and yet no successor ever matched Capone's fame. No one else captured the public's imagination quite like he did. His name endured in books, TV shows, and gangster lore. Even children, decades removed from his era, would grow up knowing the name Al Capone. He had, in a sense, achieved what so many criminals failed to: immortality. But his empire did not. What Capone built with bullets and bootlegging would not last. It was dismantled, piece by piece, by those who understood that power gained through fear is always borrowed, and sooner or later, someone comes to collect. Al Capone died in 1947, a shell of the man he once was. His body had surrendered to neurosyphilis, but his legend had already slipped free from mortality. In the years following his death, Capone became something larger than the life he had actually lived. He became an icon, a myth, a cautionary tale, and a source of endless fascination for the American public. The mythologizing of Al Capone didn't wait until after his death. It began while he was still alive, during the height of his power, when headlines screamed his name in bold print, and when newsreels captured his rare public appearances. But it grew exponentially after his fall, as the nation tried to make sense of the man who had embodied both the darkest and most alluring parts of the American spirit. Capone was the perfect character for a new kind of media-driven storytelling. He had it all: a rags-to-riches background, a flamboyant personality, undeniable charisma, brutal ruthlessness, and a dramatic downfall. He was equal parts villain and folk hero, a man who had taken what he wanted and dared the world to stop him. And in the end, he was brought down not by bullets, but by a quiet accountant's ledger. This contradiction, the gangster undone by paperwork, fascinated the public. In the 1950s and 60s, as television began to take root in American homes, crime dramas emerged as a staple of programming. Capone's name appeared regularly in documentaries, dramatizations, and true crime series. Hollywood couldn't get enough of him. In 1959, Rod Steiger played him in the film Al Capone, a dark, brooding portrayal that emphasized his rise to power. Later depictions, like Robert De Niro's performance in The Untouchables, 1987, added layers of complexity, showing a Capone who was not just dangerous, but also deeply insecure and obsessed with legacy. Each generation seemed to reinterpret Capone for its own purposes. In the 1970s, amid Watergate and political scandals, he symbolized unchecked power and systemic corruption. In the 1980s, during a surge of economic ambition and Wall Street excess, he was viewed as the ultimate outlaw capitalist. And in more recent years, he has appeared in everything from gangster rap lyrics to video games. His face etched into pop culture with the same permanence as Marilyn Monroe or James Dean. But beneath the myth was a real man. And understanding that man is key to understanding why his story has endured. Capone was not simply a gangster, he was a master of public perception. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not hide in the shadows. He granted interviews. He smiled for cameras. He courted journalists and spun his own narrative. He spoke about feeding the poor, keeping the peace, and protecting his neighborhoods. He presented himself as a community figure, a necessary evil in an unjust system. And for many in Chicago's immigrant and working class neighborhoods, that version of Capone felt real. To the Italian-American communities of the early 20th century, many of whom faced poverty, discrimination, and limited opportunities, Capone's rise represented something deeper than criminality. It symbolized resistance, a man who looked like them, spoke like them, and came from where they came from, had taken on the system and won, until he didn't. This duality, admiration and condemnation, is what kept Capone in the public imagination for so long. He wasn't easy to categorize. He was brutal, yes, but also clever, dangerous, but also generous. A villain, but also a symbol of survival. As the decades passed, historians began to peel back the layers of the myth. They dug into court documents, FBI files, newspaper archives. They painted a more complete picture, a man who was both deeply intelligent and deeply flawed. A man who ran his empire with ruthless efficiency, but who also made critical strategic mistakes. A man who demanded loyalty but trusted the wrong people. A man who could see the big picture but who couldn't see his own decline. Capone's psychological profile, too, has become a topic of academic curiosity. Was he a narcissist, a sociopath, a traumatized child of poverty and violence, or simply a product of his environment, made by a system that rewarded aggression, punished vulnerability, and left few other avenues for success? And then, of course, there is the matter of prohibition itself. Many historians argue that Capone's empire could never have existed without it. The federal government's decision to outlaw alcohol created an instant black market, one so vast and so profitable that it made crime more lucrative than any legitimate business for a time. Capone didn't invent organized crime. He capitalized on an opportunity that had been handed to him on a silver platter. He simply did it better and flashier than anyone else. And that, too, is part of the American story. Opportunity, risk, reward. In school, textbooks and pop culture retrospectives, Capone's image remains. His fedora, his cigar, his smirk. He is the face of the gangster, the template for countless fictional criminals who followed. Tony Montana, Michael Corleone, Tommy DeVito, all of them, in some way, owe a debt to Al Capone. But there's a lesson embedded in his legend too, a warning. Capone showed what happens when ambition outpaces accountability, when power operates without checks, when a man confuses fear with respect. He was brilliant, but he lacked foresight. He built an empire but couldn't protect it. He inspired loyalty but cultivated betrayal. He courted fame but failed to understand its consequences. And perhaps most tragically, he became a prisoner long before he entered a cell. He was imprisoned by his own image, by the character he created, the reputation he curated, and the lies he began to believe. And when the world stopped believing them too, he had nowhere to hide. In that way, Capone's story isn't just a crime story, it's a human story. A story of identity, power, perception, and the inevitable collapse that comes when myth outweighs truth. Even now, nearly a century after his reign, we still talk about him, still write about him, still see shadows of him in the headlines and in the rise and fall of modern figures who fly too close to the sun. Because Al Capone wasn't just a man, he was a mirror, reflecting back the best and worst of the world that made him. To truly understand Al Capone, one must also understand the city that birthed his empire, Chicago. The windy city, with its glimmering skyline and steel-ribbed heart, was far more than a backdrop to Capone's rise. It was the crucible. Chicago didn't just tolerate gangsters, it created them. It was a place where ambition met chaos, and where Capone's unique talents could flourish, unchecked. In the early 20th century, Chicago was booming. It had transformed from a muddy frontier town into one of the most powerful industrial cities in the world. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Railroads connected it to every corner of America, and the stockyards fed millions. Immigrants arrived in droves. Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, and African American families, each group crowding into tight neighborhoods, forming insular communities and scrambling for opportunity. But with that growth came inequality, corruption, and social friction. The city was a patchwork of power and poverty, grandeur and decay. On one street, you could see mansions and opera houses. A few blocks down, children played barefoot beside sewage-filled alleys. It was this contrast that defined Chicago and created the fertile ground in which men like Capone would thrive. Politics and police, a web of complicity. The first key to Capone's success was not violence or liquor, it was corruption. Chicago's political machine in the 1920s was legendary for its brazenness. Aldermen, city councilmen, and even mayors were frequently on the payroll of vice lords and bootleggers. Elections were bought, Judges were bribed, and police officers often took money from the very people they were supposed to arrest. Capone understood this system intimately. He didn't try to fight it. He became its master. He ensured his men voted early and often. He donated to local politicians. He paid off police captains and offered them a share of the profits. In exchange, his speakeasies operated without interference. His trucks moved through the city unimpeded. And when rival gangsters were arrested, Capone's allies often found themselves out of town on vacation, conveniently unavailable to testify. Even when Capone was summoned to court or arrested in high-profile stings, the charges rarely stuck. Witnesses forgot details. Evidence went missing. The few honest lawmen who tried to bring him down found themselves transferred, demoted, or quietly threatened. In Chicago, Capone didn't just operate under the law. He operated through it. The South Side Empire, Capone's territory, was primarily the south side of Chicago, an area dominated by working-class immigrants, particularly Italians. Here, Capone was seen less as a criminal and more as a protector, a benefactor. He provided jobs when factories shut down. He funded community centers. He paid for funerals, hosted block parties, and made himself visible in local parishes. He famously opened one of the city's first large-scale soup kitchens during the Great Depression, feeding thousands daily. His generosity was strategic. It built goodwill and loyalty, particularly among communities that already distrusted the police and the political elite. But behind the charity was control. Capone didn't tolerate disloyalty. Local business owners who refused to pay for protection often found their storefronts burned down. Competitors who challenged his liquor routes disappeared. Informants were dealt with swiftly and permanently. Still, Capone maintained a sense of order within his domain. He paid for street repairs when the city wouldn't. He enforced strict rules on violence near schools and churches. To many in the South Side, the chaos of Chicago ended at the borders of Capone's control, not because the police imposed peace, but because Capone demanded it. The speakeasy boom. Chicago under Capone was a city that didn't stop drinking. Despite prohibition laws, alcohol flowed freely through thousands of underground clubs, bars, and restaurants. These speakeasies became cultural epicenters, places where jazz boomed, lovers danced, and the lines between law and lawlessness blurred. Capone didn't just supply these clubs, he often owned them outright. He used them as fronts for laundering money, holding meetings, and networking with celebrities, politicians, and businessmen. He also maintained a tight grip on liquor quality, distribution, and pricing. If you wanted to run a club in Chicago, you needed Capone's blessing or his silence. This monopoly allowed Capone to build a network of informants, allies, and debtors across the city. Bar owners relied on him. Musicians worked for him. Even legitimate businesses, facing economic collapse, turned to him for help. The media circus. Chicago's newspapers were both Capone's greatest tool and his greatest threat. The public was hungry for gangster stories, and Capone, with his tailored suits and bold attitude, made headlines sell. Reporters followed his every move, often with his cooperation. He posed for photos, granted interviews, and even spoke about his business as if he were a misunderstood entrepreneur. He once told a reporter, "I give the public what it wants. All I do is satisfy a public demand." In many ways, he wasn't wrong. Chicago drank the liquor he sold, danced in his clubs, and rooted for him when he sparred with federal agents. But this fame came at a cost. As Capone's public profile grew, so did the attention from Washington. His face appeared on wanted posters and political cartoons. Senators used his name during speeches. He became a symbol not just of organized crime, but of the government's failure to control it. And when the time came to take him down, that notoriety made him a target too big to ignore. The psychological grip. Perhaps the most profound way Capone controlled Chicago was psychological. He created a world where the lines between legality and morality blurred. He didn't just break the law, he rewrote the rules. In his Chicago, crime paid. It bought food, shelter, protection, even prestige. Young men idolized him. They mimicked his style, his speech, his swagger. Politicians envied his influence. And many ordinary citizens, beaten down by the Depression and distrustful of corrupt institutions, viewed Capone as a necessary evil, if not a preferable one. And yet, under the surface, fear always lingered. Capone's power was total, but it was fragile. It relied on silence, complicity, and the illusion of invincibility. And when that illusion cracked, when investigators dug deeper, when journalists stopped playing along, when his own men whispered in shadows, the whole structure began to tremble. Chicago, in the end, had built Capone, and it would also outlast him, but it never forgot him. Even today, you can feel his ghost in the old neighborhoods, in the bars that were once speakeasies, in the alleys that still carry echoes of bootsteps and gunfire, in the city's hard-earned distrust of power and its complicated pride in being a place where history isn't just studied, it's lived. Al Capone made Chicago famous, but he also reminded it violently, brilliantly, and fatally of the cost of letting power go unchecked. As the dust of Al Capone's reign settled into the cracks of Chicago's pavement, his legacy did not fade. It evolved. Though the man himself died in 1947, the blueprint he left behind shaped the trajectory of organized crime in America for decades to come. The tactics he used, the networks he built, and the persona he crafted became templates for criminal enterprises, both at home and abroad. And perhaps more surprisingly, his cultural influence reached far beyond the criminal world, into politics, business, entertainment, and even fashion. The evolution of organized crime. Capone's empire may have collapsed, but its foundations endured. The Chicago outfit continued to thrive long after his imprisonment. Under successors like Paul Ricker, Tony Accardo, and Sam Giancana, the organization transitioned from overt violence and public spectacle to quiet, calculated infiltration. Labor unions, construction companies, casinos, and even international ventures became the new battlegrounds. Capone had shown that raw brutality could win battles, but subtlety won wars. Later mob bosses learned from his mistakes. They kept lower profiles, minimized media exposure, and focused on long-term influence rather than flashy dominance. The outfit stopped making headlines, but its hands remained deep in the city's pockets. Elsewhere, other cities saw their own Capones rise. In New York, the five families flourished: Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, and others, building complex criminal syndicates rooted in the structures Capone had pioneered. Hierarchical chains of command, compartmentalized operations, and strict codes of silence like omerta. Internationally, Capone's legacy influenced criminal empires in Sicily, Colombia, Russia, and Japan. He was studied not just as a gangster, but as a strategist, a man who understood power, publicity, and people. A figure reimagined. Meanwhile, the myth of Capone underwent its own evolution. In literature, he appeared as both character and archetype, the flawed anti-hero in noir fiction, the charming villain in crime sagas. Authors used him to explore questions of morality, capitalism, and American identity. In film, Capone became a cinematic staple. He was portrayed dozens of times, often as a larger-than-life figure dripping in menace and charisma. Robert De Niro's performance in The Untouchables, 1987, immortalized his volatile, theatrical persona for new generations. Even in parodies and comedies, Capone's ghost loomed. His silhouette, his cigar, his fedora. Television followed suit. From docudramas to documentaries, Capone's life has been dissected in more detail than some presidents. Each retelling adds new angles. Was he a victim of circumstance? A visionary criminal? A tragic figure consumed by his own legend? Even in music and fashion, Capone's imprint endures. His style, pinstripe suits, wide-brimmed hats, polished shoes, has been referenced in hip-hop videos, designer collections, and stage performances. Artists from Tupac Shakur to Jay-Z have name-dropped him in lyrics, often as a symbol of ambition, rebellion, and self-made power. The dark side of admiration. But with admiration comes danger. The romanticization of Capone raises questions about the cultural messages we absorb. When we glorify his rise without reckoning with his consequences, do we obscure the violence, fear, and suffering that defined his rule? When we treat him as a folk hero, do we trivialize the lives lost and the communities damaged? The answer isn't simple. Capone's story is captivating precisely because it's morally complex. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was real, nuanced, strategic, occasionally generous, often brutal. That complexity, makes him fascinating, but it also makes it essential to remember the full picture. Capone's empire wasn't built with charm. It was built with blood, tourism, and historic memory. Today, Chicago remains a city in conversation with Capone's memory. Tours take visitors to old speakeasy locations, sites of infamous shootings, and the remnants of his former haunts. Museums feature exhibits on prohibition and organized crime. Books continue to explore his rise, trial, and mysterious personal life. And locals, depending on who you ask, either shrug him off or speak of him with a mix of dread and dark fascination. Some see him as a symptom of a broken system. Others view him as a manipulator of that system. Either way, his presence is undeniable. He's in the city's DNA, woven between steel beams and sidewalk cracks, whispered in alleyways, immortalized in ink. Legacy in law and policy. Capone also left a lasting mark on American law enforcement. His trial and conviction reshaped how federal agencies approached organized crime. The IRS, once considered a bureaucratic backwater, emerged as a powerful weapon against criminals who otherwise eluded justice. The phrase "follow the money" became a guiding principle for investigators across the country. Capone's downfall showed that no one was above the law, not even the most feared man in America. It galvanized the creation of new federal tools, RICO laws, witness protection programs, and task forces dedicated to financial crimes. In essence, Capone didn't just shape crime, he reshaped the response to it. Final. Reflection. Capone's world was brutal, brilliant, and brief. His empire burned hot and fast, consuming everything in its path. But what survived that fire, his myth, his influence, his cautionary tale, is what makes him endure. He is a legend, not because he succeeded, but because of how spectacularly he rose, and how inevitably he fell. In the end, Capone was a man caught between two Americas, one that punished him and one that created him. Much of what the world remembers about Al Capone is wrapped in public spectacle, courtrooms, headlines, cigar smoke, and gunfire. He is remembered for his empire, his crimes, and his fall. But there was another side to him, one that few truly saw. Behind the facade of the crime boss, behind the suits and the bravado, was a man who lived with deep contradictions, quiet fears, and a mind that, in the end, betrayed him. To understand the full picture of Al Capone, we must step away from the streets of Chicago and into his private world, his home life, his relationships, his vulnerabilities, and the inner demons that would haunt him long after the last headline faded. Family first. Or so it seemed. Capone was, in many ways, a family man. He married May Josephine Coughlin in 1918, shortly after the birth of their only child, Albert Francis Capone, known as Sonny. May was Irish Catholic, a quiet and deeply private woman, and she remained loyal to Al through all the chaos. She managed their home and protected Sonny from the public scrutiny that swirled around his father. Capone was reportedly a doting father. He spoiled Sonny with gifts and affection and insisted that he be kept out of the business entirely. Friends and associates often commented on how different Capone was around his son, gentler, calmer, more reflective. To Capone, family was sacred. It was a rare constant in a world full of shifting loyalties and danger. But the irony was striking. While he played the role of devoted husband and father, his criminal empire thrived on the destruction of other families. His liquor fueled addictions. His orders ended lives. His bribes corrupted communities. Yet at home, he cradled his child and kissed his wife goodnight. This dichotomy, ruthless boss and loving father, was one of the defining tensions of Capone's life. Luxury and loneliness. Despite his wealth, Capone's lifestyle wasn't just one of comfort. It was one of isolation. He lived in constant fear of assassination, rival gangs, police raids, and betrayal from within his own ranks made trust nearly impossible. He traveled with bodyguards, avoided routines, and often moved from location to location to avoid being targeted. His estate on Palm Island in Miami, purchased in the late 1920s, became both a refuge and a fortress. Surrounded by water and guarded at all times, the home featured hidden escape routes and steel-reinforced doors. Inside, Capone tried to enjoy the spoils of his success: parties, music, good food. But even in paradise, the fear followed him. He suffered from migraines, insomnia, and stomach ulcers, ailments made worse by his increasing paranoia. Despite his public persona as a man in control, Capone's private moments revealed someone constantly looking over his shoulder, suspecting even his closest allies. Health and decline. Perhaps the most tragic chapter in Capone's personal life was his slow, humiliating descent into cognitive decline. By the late 1920s, Capone had begun to show signs of neurosyphilis, though he kept it hidden from the public. The disease had been contracted in his youth and left untreated for years. In the beginning, it caused only occasional mood swings and headaches, but by the time he was imprisoned in Atlanta and later Alcatraz, the symptoms had worsened dramatically. Capone became forgetful, disoriented, and increasingly irrational. He struggled to understand conversations, forgot names, and sometimes failed to recognize his surroundings. He would fly into rages, then collapse into silence. Guards and inmates alike noticed his erratic behavior. Once a feared mastermind, he was now a figure of confusion and ridicule. By the time of his release, Capone's mind was unraveling. He spent his final years in a haze of dementia, often living in a fantasy world where he still ran Chicago. He gave orders to imaginary subordinates and spoke of meetings that never happened. His wife and son shielded him from the media and cared for him quietly, away from the public eye. He died in 1947, not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, private home, surrounded by family, but robbed of the mind that had once outwitted the world. The inner world of Al Capone. What drove Al Capone? Was it greed, power, survival, or something deeper? Psychologists and historians have long speculated about the inner workings of his mind. Some believe he was a classic narcissist, driven by a need for admiration, devoid of empathy. Others see traces of trauma from his upbringing in Brooklyn's violent slums, where poverty and street gangs were everyday realities. He was known to have a temper, but also a charm. He could intimidate with a glance, then turn around and disarm a room with humor. He read people well. He knew what they feared, what they wanted, and how to give just enough to win loyalty or extract silence. He wasn't educated beyond grade school, but he was intelligent. He understood systems, how to game them, how to bend them, how to move within them without being caught. He wasn't impulsive by nature, but he knew when to act decisively. And above all, he was a master of illusion, of crafting an image that people feared, respected, and in some cases, admired. But beneath that image was a man plagued by contradictions. He craved respect, but built his name on fear. He wanted peace, but created chaos. He protected his family while destroying others. And in the end, the persona he had crafted became a prison tighter than any cell he would ever enter. Legacy of the private man. When we strip away the headlines, the mythology, and the legend, what's left of Al Capone? A husband, a father, a frightened man who climbed to unimaginable heights and spent the rest of his life trying to hold on to them. A man who made history, but could not escape it. Capone's personal life reminds us that even the most powerful figures are, in the end, human, fragile, flawed, and subject to the same fears, sicknesses, and regrets as anyone else. His public life was spectacle. His private life was tragedy. And in the space between those two realities, the true story of Al Capone takes shape. Al Capone's life was a storm, loud, violent, unpredictable. He rose from the immigrant streets of Brooklyn to become the most feared man in America, built an empire on vice and corruption, and saw it all crumble under the weight of disease, time, and law. But in the silence that followed, what remains? A name, a legend, a lesson. Capone's story is more than crime history. It's a mirror held up to society. It asks what happens when ambition is left unchecked, when systems fail, and when power is allowed to corrupt absolutely. He didn't die in a hail of bullets, nor as a king surrounded by followers. He died quietly, confused and broken, far from the streets he once ruled. And yet, nearly a century later, we still remember, still study, still wonder, because some stories are too powerful to forget.